Hi, everyone. Welcome to Asians Represent. My name is Isa, and I am the host for this episode in which we are going to be discussing how we, as mixed race people, represent our mixed race heritage and identity in D&D and TTRPGs. In the previous mixed race representation panel, we covered how being mixed race is portrayed in official RPG materials and in media in general, and some of the many problems that arise from that. So if you didn't catch that, be sure to check it out because there's a lot of topics we covered there. But we still felt like we had a lot more to say on the very complex subject of mixed race representation. So we're back. And in this panel, we'll be more focused on how we choose to represent ourselves and our mixed race identity, or the mixed race identity of our characters when playing TTRPGs and our experiences while doing so. And before we dive in, I'm going to let all these awesome, lovely panelists here introduce themselves, starting with Kimchi.
Oh, okay. I'm Legal Kimchi. I'm a YouTuber who makes video essays with regards to TTRPGs and related topics to that. You can find me at youtube.com/legalkimchi or on Twitter, YouTube or twitter.com/legalkimchi. Legal Kimchi in all of the things. So if you like those deep dives into those types of topics, including mixed race heritage and how I view it in a TTRPG realm, I've done a video on that. You can find it on my YouTube channel.
Cool. And next up is Drew.
Hello, everyone. My name is Drew. I am the Discord community manager for Asians Represent. So you'll find me a lot around there, or you'll find me on Twitter at Drew Kwan. Beyond that, I am 50% Chinese and I'm 50% vaguely European. Just kind of all over the place. So yeah, glad to be here.
Happy to have you on. And next is Emma.
Hello. I'm an archaeologist who has found their way into the TTRPG world. I can't say recently anymore because it's been several years now, but yeah, I work in TTRPGs sometimes as a cultural consultant or a sensitivity reader. I am also part of the Asians Rep community. I am mixed Japanese and mixed generation, I think is what I said last time too. I don't know if there's anything else. My Twitter account is on the overlay, so I'm not going to bother saying that out loud.
And Sonya.
Hi, everybody. I'm Sonya, aka Sony Baloney Art across all social media. I'm a freelance character designer and illustrator, mostly for tabletop stuff, while I try to make it and break into the animation industry here in Los Angeles. You can find some of my work in the recently released Uncaged Goddesses and Die Hard Dice's Adventuring Artist Tarot deck, which my card recently got released. I did the Wheel of Fortune card. And as for what I am Filipino, Polynesian, Hakka Chinese, Black, and Ashkenazi Jewish. It's a lot, but it's me.
And Jeremy.
Hello, I am Jeremy. I go by Pixel Grotto on Twitter. You can look at me there for most of my recent writings. I write for D&D Beyond. I've written for Metal Weave Games. I've done some private projects and design work here and there. And I most recently updated my portfolio site. So if you want somebody to write TTRPG content for you, or video game content, or comic book content, then hit me up there. As for my exact racial background, for anyone who didn't watch last time or listen last time, I am half Taiwanese and half American Jewish.
I don't think I actually stated mine this time around. No. Clarification. I am Korean, Spanish, and Puerto Rican. So.
Cool. And I should probably also introduce myself as well. So like I said, my name is Isa and my own background is Pakistani, Syrian, Spanish, Polish, Ashkenazi Jewish, and Moroccan Sephardic Jewish. Like Sonya said, it's a lot, but it's me. I relate a lot. And I'm a TTRPG streamer. I've done a lot of stuff with Asians Represent before, like Critical Read Al-Qadim, and the previous mixed race panel and panels on like clothing and costume and visual design in relation to racial representation. And I'm also a cosplayer and a designer, and I do a million things because I'm a millennial. So of course I have like 80 jobs and no money. Yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to get too real, like right up front there. We have other even more real topics to get into. So, moving into said topics, up front, I just wanted to mention that, as I said before, this subject of mixed race representation is a really complex one. It's also one that often gets overlooked. I think everyone here would agree. Being mixed race is often utilized, in particular in fantasy media, in a lot of really uncomfortable and harmful ways, often without that harm ever even being noticed or acknowledged. For example, I think about how a few months ago I like slogged and clawed my way through watching The Witcher and was just utterly exhausted by the horrible ways in which being mixed race is portrayed in that series, among many other issues I had with the show. And I say exhausted rather than shocked because it was all things I'd seen before a million times. It's very commonplace for being mixed race to be represented as a form of suffering and penance in fantasy media.
Sad
and this is a topic.
Backstory seasoning.
Yep, sad backstory seasoning. And that's a topic we discussed a lot last time. So again, if you want to see that more in depth, go watch the previous panel. So I hope that with us discussing this topic today of how we choose to represent ourselves, hearing from a lovely, varied group of mixed race people with lots of different backgrounds and experiences about the different ways in which we all have found joy or interest or self-discovery in exploring our own identities, things we found to be productive or positive, things we haven't found to be productive, we can just chip away a little bit at those tired, expected portrayals that you see over and over again and show things from our perspectives for a change. So I guess a broad topic to start with is whether and how we like to express and explore our mixed race identity when playing RPGs, whether that's through player characters or NPCs if you're a forever GM. And so are there any examples anyone has of characters you've played, themes you've explored that really stood out to you where you felt like you were getting to represent that side of yourself?
Well, for me, I recently got an opportunity to play a mixed character, and I've noticed that the way that I portrayed him was very similar to how I portray the NPCs who are mixed in my world. And it's very much it's not a thing. Like people just ask, okay, yeah, my mother was Orcish and my father was Elven or something like that. And it's goes into that, and the character would talk about different notes from the various cultures that he was from, but then just move on. I didn't want to, as Sonya and Issa pointed out, just have that as sad backstory seasoning. His backstory was fantastic. He loved it. His parents were sea traders and occasional pirates, and he grew up on the sea. He had a lot of adventure. He loved it. He keeps doing it. It's the family business, and his parents are still alive and well and proud of him. And like it was one of those things where I think it came out in sort of like offhanded comments of, it's like, there's a fine elf wine. It's like my mother used to drink. She was the orc. Yeah, well, that was part of the reason why she got with my dad. Like, it was just like little things like that that would filter into it, but not batting an eye at any of that and trying to ease their way, being knowledgeable of the customs in whatever location they found themselves in. So
yeah, so finding value in allowing it to be a casual, incidental form of representation rather than it having to be this big, like, overwrought thing that informs every aspect of everything he ever does.
Yeah, it's like, don't you feel represented?
It's like, I didn't want to center the story on the fact that he was mixed. I didn't want that to be the defining characteristic of the character. I wanted the defining characteristic of the character to be the funny voice that I was using.
And you're going to do the funny voice.
Well, of course, I'm going to do the funny voice. I do the funny voice all the time. Okay.
Well, there we go.
I like doing the funny voices. So I picked up this voice on various ports. It's all over the place and it changes per sentence. So, it was one of those things where it was going for more of a broad, more of a humorous type character, and to have someone who's very cosmopolitan, is very like, I was born on a ship. I went around. I know the places and customs of the people around me. So it was just playing along with that. So that was the idea. And I haven't like, I love doing voices. So there's that.
Yeah, I think there's, so very often when I think about like representation in media, like with the capital R and all that shit, I think about like how there are different forms of representing like culture and identity and stuff like that. And one can be the incidental representation, where you have a character who happens to be a particular ethnicity or a particular gender or whatever. And then there's representation where the character could only be that ethnicity or that gender because their story kind of revolves around it, and how both have value, both can be positive, both can also end up with some like uncomfortable themes in them, depending on who's writing them and how they're written and stuff like that. So I definitely see that there's value in being allowed to explore the breadth of that, everything from incidental to where it's like completely necessary for that character to be from that particular background, and where it's something you're deliberately exploring. I
don't know if this is just me, but being more of a forever DM type of person, like playing that character in someone else's game, I almost felt like I had less control of the totality of the narrative. Right. And so I would be less comfortable playing a character where it was centralized, where it was like only a mixed person could do this, right? Whereas if I'm DMing the game, I have a little bit more exerted control over it. So I'd be more comfortable creating a centralized story for like an NPC or something like that.
Yeah.
So there was a little of that thought process going in beforehand.
No, I totally understand that, because I have actually, for me, I'm on the opposite side of the spectrum where I actually haven't played a whole lot of mixed race characters. And it's largely because of one, since I'm the player, a lot of the DMs, like the two long-term DMs I played with, they're both white. So oftentimes I'm just like, okay, beyond like the added thing of like, other added baggage, which is like, it's not really a narrative that I expect them to understand or tackle with the nuance that I expect. I love these people. I trust them. Don't trust them with that. And they completely understand, because again, it's not their lived experience. And like, even though there are times like, there are like aspects of like, for example, my Air Genasi Faye, now I see, even though she is coded as like Chinese, because all my characters are like broken up into different segments of what makes me. Faye is Chinese, but I also viewed her as mixed. And like when me and my fellow player who plays my twin brother in the game, we had the backstory. We're both like, we are both Black. And we both agreed that, we have the backstory added, just like a tiny little thing, like the twins were a bit different and they were picked on a little bit as children. And Kimchi's going to go get his pizza.
Get the pizza.
Get the pizza.
But like, I know what toppings are on that pizza.
We need to know. But we both agreed, as both, like, people of color, that we were okay with having that element of the twins were different. Their parents are human. They were born Air Genasi as a result of weird shit happening. And they were picked on a little bit as kids. And it did find kind of like, especially for my character, form a kind of underlying current of like how she just reacted to people. Like she didn't really trust people. She stuck closer to her family, more closely to her brother, because like we even talked about this, how your sibling, who is also mixed race and the same as like you, are like the only people that can really understand your experience and whatnot. And so she stuck close to her brother because like, you're kind of the only one that gets me. The two of them have their both separate lives, but they stick really close to each other. They have tendencies to, when they are pressed for private information, they will close fucking ranks. And it's really funny. But it was just something that both me and my fellow player agreed on. Also, it was really nice to be able to explore that, like, because my DM didn't add the fantasy racism thing. So it was kind of just like an internal exploration. And I know people are going to be like, but Sonya, you said that that's like the stereotypes you want to avoid. There is a difference when it's me, a mixed race person, unpacking my own trauma versus white person that wants to make a blood quantum elven kingdom and make it the central point of their plot.
Yeah, there's
Absolutely.
a big difference too between like getting picked on, because I think that's a pretty standard childhood experience, because children are the worst.
Yeah.
They're quite cruel. And there's a difference between that and experiencing systemic, sustained,
Exactly.
society-wide discrimination and prejudice, and like getting shat on by all of the adults and everyone in a certain society. Like, there's a huge difference between those two things.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And I think also something you touched on that's really, really important is when and how we can feel comfortable to play characters that explore mixed race identity or any sort of like non-white identity. Because I know, for example, that I have some characters where their racial identity in D&D terms is like very central to the character, and it's something that I deliberately wanted to explore. And I have others where it's more incidental, as Kimchi said. And I've had some very, very positive experiences playing one character in particular who I've ended up playing multiple times because sadly, I had a really horrible experience trying to play her in a group where a lot of racism ended up happening, and I was very shocked by like that being a thing in that group, and it ended up feeling like I didn't get to play the character as I wanted to play her, and it all felt very, frankly, actually quite traumatic. So now I play her again, and I play her with a GM who is white, but who I trust very, very much. Also happens to be my partner, so like that helps. So that helps. But now I get to actually like explore the mixed race representation, the Swana and South Asian representation, the Genasi aspects of the character, because I'm sure we'll get into it a bit later, like Genasi, hella mixed race coded. And I feel safe to do that with that GM in that space, but haven't felt safe to do that in other spaces, or have tried to do it and then realized that it isn't a safe area to do that in. And that can be really upsetting and leave like lasting kind of effects. Like for a while I didn't want to play that character anymore, and I felt really sad about that because it was a character that meant a lot to me. So I think if you are a GM who isn't mixed race and you have someone at your table wanting to explore that, talk with them about it and what they're expecting from it, what they hope for, what they don't want to happen, any like, pitfalls. Yeah. It's the same as any like safety tools talk, but for some reason, because this like idea of mixed race being something damaging and trauma, like full of trauma for a character, is so prevalent in fantasy media, people just dive into it and don't think about how that's going to feel for any mixed race people at the table quite often.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's even with the lines and veils and things of that nature. I mean, you don't find them on any of the pre-made, pages, because no one talks about it. That's all part of the reason why we're doing this in the first place, is people understand to a certain extent, like racism in its common forms. People understand issues with sexual assault or whatever, things like traumatic events that people have a certain common understanding of. But for some reason, like the things people understand about racism seem to fall off when you bring up the mixed race thing, because it's like, well, I mean, if you're both or whatever, then that doesn't apply anymore, right?
When it starts with, well, I mean.
So I have here with me my first D&D notebook that I ever used, and the first character that I ever made in the game, Dine Cinderpaw. I'm holding him up to the camera here right now.
I love this.
But he was a ranger that I made for my first D&D game, and basically he kind of is an interesting example that corresponds to a lot of the stuff that's been said. I came up with a tremendous backstory for him because he was originally a character I wanted to write about in our series of fantasy novels that I never wrote. But the whole idea was that he was mostly white, but like a little bit Asian. But people would not really be able to tell that on the surface. I think I was trying to channel the idea of being like a quarter Asian, or like a quarter mixed race. So in the homebrew world that I created that I never really expounded upon, there were these races that had vaguely animal-like characteristics. I think the closest thing to them in D&D is shifters from Eberron, who have like, the characteristics of like wolves or like bears and stuff like that. And the whole idea for this character is that his grandmother had been a member of this race, and so his mother had been like half of that, and he was a fourth, and that you couldn't really tell because he looked mostly, I guess, what you might consider to be typically Caucasian in your standard Eurocentric fantasy setting. But the idea was that anybody who was also belonging to this animalistic race could tell by looking at like his eyes, because he had purple eyes, and it was like a telltale kind of thing. They could tell, nobody else could tell. And the whole idea was that he was actually quite fluent in the language of this race that he was descended from, but he spoke a really like old version of it. So he could go into a shop and like order weapons, and if the shopkeeper was also descended from this race, they would be able to communicate fluently, but the shopkeeper would be like, "You sound like my grandmother." And the idea was to have, he was like a buff, burly ranger dude who was like built like Dave Bautista, like a brick. But the idea was that when he spoke this language, he sounded like a grandma. And my idea for that was influenced by actually, a lot of the people in New Orleans who speak French, an older form of French. And it doesn't really sound like any other form of French that's spoken, in France. And the idea that, you might be a mixed race person who learns, like, say, Chinese, or like Japanese or whatever from your grandmother, or, your mother who might have an imperfect knowledge of it. And you come out with these interesting quirks in your speech. It was like the very first time I went to Japan, and my mom, who is Taiwanese but grew up speaking Japanese because of colonialism, told me to introduce myself to everyone using watashi, or like, as I called it back in the day, watakushi, because I couldn't pronounce it, which is like super, super polite Japanese. And I remember my host sister laughed at me for doing that. And it's just a weird quirk. And my whole idea with this first character of mine was to have all those little weird quirks in there indicating that he was kind of mixed race, but none of those were able to be explored in the games that I actually played as him, because my first DM was German. He was a great guy, but he just didn't really give me a chance to delve into that. And then I played this character in a super long campaign where he got up to level 15 and shot Demogorgon in the face with a magic arrow. But I never really got to explore these things. I got to explore some other things. This character ended up in an interracial relationship with a dwarf, and he's a human. And that was a whole thing that I explored upon. He got vaporized by a beholder ray and reincarnated as a half orc, which was really weird.
Jesus, what a roller coaster all of a sudden.
And then at the very end of the campaign, Demogorgon killed him, and he got reincarnated as a dwarf, which was really weird, because at the table I was playing at, they're like, "Oh, your wife is dwarven. Like, you're a dwarf now. That's great." But I was like, "But I don't want to be a dwarf. I want to go back to being a human. Like, that's who I am." And so there were some other things I got to explore, but I never really got to explore the hidden mixed race concepts until I started running him as a character, and as an NPC character in all the games I DM'd. And then I got to explore his character's whole life. Like, he had his happy ending. He got to be an old man. He got to retire happily with his dwarven wife and make a beautiful dwarven, mixed race child in Saltmarsh, actually, which is the last time I used him as an NPC. But it was only something that I could do because I understood the nuances. And it was only something that, other mixed race players or other people of color at the table could really pick up, because most people just don't get it.
Yeah, like when you said like other people from that race immediately know, it's like how we talked at the very end of the panel, how we have, all of us seem to have like this weird mixed race radar in the back of our head, and when we see someone that's mixed, like a mixed celebrity on TV like winning, and we're like, wait, I gotta look you up for a second, and like do the Wikipedia search, like I
get the vibe. I've got the vibe.
The vibes, they're here.
So true.
It's so true. And so like, but yeah, like it's a thing where it's just like certain GMs just don't have that tool set, It's like with my other like forever GM that I play every game with, like I don't expect them to tackle those nuances, nor am I going to bring it up with them, because again, that's not their bag. However, if I wanted to, like, say if we all wound up playing a game that was an entire panel and we wanted to explore all the aspects of being mixed race, the good, the bad, the ugly, the fabulous, whatever, like I definitely would be way more comfortable, because like, again, it's that thing, like you guys will get it. We're all really different in what makes us what we are, but there is those common threads where we're just like, yeah, no, I get that shit.
Yeah, and
like
you also, I'm sorry.
Oh, I was going to say when Jeremy was talking about making a character who was mixed race and like sort of past, but other people who were of that culture could tell, like that the character I was just talking about, her name's Elise. She's a Storm Genasi who thought she was human until she found out she was a Storm Genasi, and essentially passes as human, except she has like electric blue eyes and hair. And sometimes when she casts magic, weird shit happens and she starts to turn into what ended up like she discovered ended up being her Genasi form. And like utilizing fantasy sort of weird fantasy magic shit to explore aspects of like racial and cultural identity can be very rewarding, but also there is so much racism baked into fantasy that even I feel often like I have to be very careful with how I decide to do that. And it can be quite a minefield. And yeah, and depending on like what the other people at the table are, like what where their standing is on it as well. Can definitely affect how comfortable you feel to explore all of that.
Yeah, because I mean, it's not only the fear of this person's going to put my mixed character into this sad backstory seasoning rigmarole, right? It's not just that we're just going to hit every single trope on the tree on the way down. It's also some people get very angry that you would even want to explore these types of issues in the game. Like my mixed race video came out, good Lord, it's been over a year.
Oh my God.
But it's time.
And I got a comment on it recently where someone felt the need to say, this is ridiculous. Why this isn't an issue? So what? Who cares? Right? It should not affect you or your character at all. And in my game, it would never be a thing. I was just like, I get what you're coming from on this one, right? I feel like you mean well. But it was just, you know, the discounting of my experience, the tossing away, and the desire to play with certain topics in this unique game structure that we have with RPGs, when everybody has buy-in, you know, and that's the thing. If everybody has the buy-in for it and wants to engage in this sort of stuff, that's absolutely essential. But the tossing away of even the desire of wanting to find a group that could is another reaction of people who kind of probably misinterpret the idea of anti-racism.
Yeah, it's this weird like polarizing where on the one end you've got people who are like, well, in my fantasy world everyone's super racist, and you know, everyone hates orcs and dwarves hate humans and humans hate elves and blah blah blah, and it's everything is so important, everything about race is so important, but it's only in the bad ways. And then on the other end of the spectrum you've got the people who are just super dismissive and are like, well, no, why would anybody ever care to explore any kind of racial dynamic in
that doesn't happen.
a tabletop
sitting
game
here like, really?
yeah.
I remember. Oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say it's that whole colorblind
Yeah.
idea, and that I don't see race or I don't see color. It's like, that's not how the world works. That's not helpful at all.
it actually is another form of like weird racism by saying like, you know, oh, I'm colorblind. Just like, there, you're also contributing to a problem. But I know if I point that out, you're going to get upset at me.
Yeah.
You're going to be like, you're not being nice to me. I rescind my allyship. That whole thing.
I remember after the Oriental Adventures series, I can't remember if I saw it on Twitter, someone said it to me, or if someone said it on one of the YouTube comments, but they basically said something to the effect of like, well, maybe if you're thinking about it so much, that's because you're the one who's racist. And I was like, I don't know about that one. Like, you know,
like, oh my God.
Why
like
is that
you
always
see
the comeback?
Yeah, you see it all the time where it's like, you know, if you're the one being bothered, if you're the one thinking about it so much, you know, if you're the one seeing it, maybe that's because you're more in tune with being racist. And I was like, I don't know if that's how it works.
That is not
you
the
know?
mic drop you think it is, my guy.
It's not
And
the
that's part of that,
backstab you think it is.
Yeah, it's part of
That's
that
not
thinking
the-
that it's not like racialized people are manifesting racism by talking about it.
Yeah. But it's that whole thing of like, well, if we just never talk about racism and we never point it out, then therefore we're not being racist because we're not pointing out race.
Yeah.
And it's this weird like feeling that if you talk about anything to do with race, whether it's racism or any other aspect of like being a person of color in any way, that's a problem because now you're pointing out that race exists. And before we got to ignore it.
Yeah, so it's not racism isn't Voldemort.
Yeah.
You know? Like,
Or like
Seek not, seek not.
yeah.
I think
It's-
there's an interest. Oh, sorry, Kimchi, were you gonna say something?
It was just offhanded comments. The Morgan Freeman head slap, because Morgan Freeman is one of those people who just consistently will repeat the "stop talking about racism" and racism will end. It's just like, no, that's not how that works.
That's not how it works.
There's an interesting side to this though, where like the most recent D&D character I'm playing is a Genasi, and I am playing her as a mixed race Genasi. She and my first character are the ones that I've specifically coded as mixed race, and this Genasi character, I kind of imagine her as like Okinawan mixed with Southeast Asian, and throughout the game, I try my best to evoke the fact that, you know, she is a person of color, she is mixed race, she does have an interesting heritage that is a little different from some of the other players at the table. And at one point, this other guy that I'm playing with, he is of Indian descent. We got on the topic of talking about like representation of POC characters in fantasy, and he asked me, "Oh, your character is a POC, right? Because I guess she's technically blue, right?" And I was like, "Yeah." And then I went to this whole thing like talking about you know how I am intentionally trying to present her as mixed race. And then I asked him about his character. He plays this funny little gnome with like a mechanical backpack that does all this cool stuff. And he was like, "Nah, he's white." And then he said, "Oh, I'll play a character of color at one point, but I'm not ready for that yet." And I thought that was interesting, the idea that I'm not ready for that yet, especially coming from another person of color.
I can understand that.
No,
though.
I get it. I
Yeah,
get
I
it.
get it.
Because D&D, specifically D&D as a game, does set you up in this mostly Eurocentric framework where the default is kind of expected that you're probably going to be a white person, or at least if you are a person of color, that's not at the forefront of your character. And this friend of mine, he's only been playing D&D for a little bit less than a year. And when he said, "I'm not ready for that yet," I found that interesting, because I think there was like a cog turning in his head, like, "Oh, I would probably need to put a little bit more thought into that if I wanted to do justice to a character in that sense." And I'm not ready for that. There aren't tools to
I
get
think
me
the other,
do that.
the
It
other
makes a lot of sense. I
part
feel
of
that.
Yeah, the other part of that is that when, like you say, if your character is a person of color, it's either not important or it really, really is in a really bad way, because they are from Karatur or they're from Al Qadim, or and these settings which are deeply racist and deeply tokenizing and all the rest of it. And so it can feel like a lot of pressure to have to
Suddenly you have the weight of an entire nation on your shoulders to represent
exactly.
at a table.
Like
Go ahead.
I was gonna say, when I first started playing D&D, I know that I was at a point in my life where I was just starting to explore a lot of the other sides of my heritage that I hadn't gotten the chance to explore a lot growing up, which would be the like South Asian and Swana, which for anyone who doesn't know is Southwest Asian and North African. Sometimes people use like Middle Eastern or MENA for that, but I prefer Swana. And I latched onto Genasi very, very quickly, seeing immediately how they were deeply mixed race coded and also deeply Swana coded. And I'm not saying that it's done well across the board. There's a lot of issues with like the language that's used. There's a lot of talk about like, creatures of two worlds, but belonging to neither. Their genie parents don't care about them, blah, 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 which isn't what I would like. And I remember like immediately going like, oh, I like the seed of that idea. And then just being like, but now I'm going to play a Genasi. I'm going to rewrite all the lore. And so it is more work.
Canon and I fix the canon.
Yeah, and I fixed the canon. And so I immediately gave myself so much more work to do. But not only that, but also like emotional labor. And then when it turned out that people at that table didn't react too kindly to certain things I was trying to do, it put even more emotional labor on me and made me think that I was maybe doing something wrong. So it can be, I can see why people might hesitate. Definitely.
You see, it's weird to me because you get folks who are not very willing to accommodate you doing that at the table. Okay. Like if Marvel gets to redo what the 10 rings are between Iron Man 3 or 1 and 3 and, Shang-Chi, then like if you're going to play the game in the Forgotten Realms, then when my character comes from Goguryeo, well, he's going to come from like 7th century Korea because I know a bit about 7th century Korea. So I'm going to make it's like, see, from that Karator region, it's like, well, no, he's literally from this area, which the Forgotten Realms took the name from the actual ancient area. Guess what? I'm going to make it that area. And it's going to be the real area. And with all of the things that come along with that, I don't understand why someone would be so against that restructuring. Like in my own world, I had 2 times I've run games recently. I had a person come up to me and go, "Hey, your idea of like this culture here, how betrothed are you to that?" And I was like, "No, just change it. Like make it up. Like I'm not publishing this thing, or I don't like it's not even though I created it, even though it's my homebrew world. If you have a better idea for this that's more comfortable for you, that you like playing better, go for it." Like, I don't know. I don't get people being so, we have to keep it the old racist way.
It's something
the old guard.
Something I've definitely noticed the more I play D&D and the more I dipped out of D&D for a bit because I realized how rigid and racist it was. And then I came back into it like, I'm prepared to change every fucking thing. Nothing is safe from me. But the thing I've realized is that people get so bogged down in making sure everything is like the same and accurate, quote unquote, even though D&D has had a million fucking editions and all the rest of it. But like it has to be accurate.
Why are there black dwarves in Lord of the Rings?
but not even to do with race, like even just to do with if you choose to homebrew something in a way people don't like I remember a particular post I made recently about how my GM made a Tarask that had like double the hit points and I used a homebrew spell to kill it and people got real fucking mad.
They got mad. I thought that shit was
cool.
I mean,
how many of those people have actually fought a Tarask? Like honestly, like you can do whatever you want with Tarasks.
I know, right? And it's that people were mad that we changed the Tarask and that we used a homebrew spell to kill it and that it wasn't all.
Then people should get mad at all forms of homebrew, especially in 5th edition.
Yeah.
5th edition encourages you to homebrew and hack the hell out of everything.
Yeah, and when people get mad, I've gotten to that point where I am like Izza. It's like you shouldn't be playing it like this, or like, oh, your Triton doesn't look like a Triton because originally she was supposed to be half Triton, but then my DM said no homebrew. We have to get started on Curse of Strahd, so I wound up tossing away the mixed race narrative and opting for a diaspora narrative. I will get into that maybe later, but it wasn't anything malicious, and I've talked to my DM about it extensively. She has apologized and also has said, like, I am encouraging you, use elf and orc have a baby next campaign. You can go do it. But like, it has to do with like, just like, they get so mad about like us changing things to make it more comfortable, make it more less racist. And every time they just like get like more mad, I'm just like that one comment, like, I will increase the fucking thing.
Yeah.
Can't stop me.
But because
but like
not only is sorry.
Yeah. But also like going back to like Jeremy's friend, it's just like, I don't think I'm ready for that. It comes with that added, like, like, even though you haven't fully thought of it, just rapid fire in your head, you kind of already know there's going to be a lot more emotional labor. There's going to be a lot more things I have to teach the table about my culture and I have to go through. Am I willing to do that? Or if like you're, present on social media and you talk about your characters and stuff, am I willing to potentially go through like the backlash that is going to like go through and whatnot? It's just like, am I ready to step into that? Because also it just comes with the fact, like, not only just people don't want to change, or like, for me, the reason why I discovered why I didn't play a lot of mixed race characters is because for my entire life, it's that not so subtle, very in your face thing of, okay, dragons, magic, curses, all that shit, that can happen. Being a brown person, being an Asian person in a fantasy setting, no, my immersion is broken. Nope, can't do that. So just like being like a person of color, that's maybe just like, Chinese in a fantasy setting. That's too far. And then my brain goes a step further, like, oh, me wanting to play a mixed race character that's like 5 different things. That's way too far, and nobody is going to want to deal with that. And also just because like D&D at its like, if you only have the player's handbook, the free stuff available on D&D Beyond, say you're new to the hobby, you don't know what homebrewing is, you get stuck within these confines, and there isn't really the tools to create these like mixed race nuanced characters until you start getting into like third-party supplements. Like D&D and D&D Beyond are doing like a better job of like, okay, we're going to try to get rid of the racism. And, you're starting like ability score bonuses. You can now assign them to whatever. They're not tied to your specific race. That's great. But also, again, that's one step in one direction. But again,
it's a drop in an ocean.
It's a drop in a vast ocean.
Yeah.
And it doesn't help really with the mixed race thing. But like, you have third-party supplements that you can get to that do kind of help you out a little bit with that. But we still got a long way to go. But it's that thing of just like everything so far is like a screaming cacophony saying like, this is too complicated, do not interact.
In fact, something I find quite uncomfortable about the way that the D&D community in general talks about being mixed race is that because race is seen as this rigid mechanized thing, and as I mentioned, people don't like to change the thing, they get very particular about it. It's supposed to be like this and we can't change it. So you can have half orcs, you can have half elves, but no, if you want to make another kind of mixed race character, that's a step too far. And what ends up happening is people kind of mock the very idea of wanting to play a mixed race character who isn't the standard like 2 that we get, to the point where like I've noticed that it's sort of the butt of a joke about like edgy players and players who write super long backstories and make too complex characters that are too complex. A part of that is always like, haha, they want to play a half Asimar, half Kalashtar, multi-class, blah, blah, blah. And they list off all these things. And included in there is almost always some sort of like half this, half that race.
Yep.
Mixed race character.
Which becomes a joke.
Yeah, like I don't think it's deliberate, but it's an example of how the combination of this like heavily mechanized, rigid race system in the game, plus the racism and specific racism towards mixed race people that's baked into a lot of fantasy media and D&D comes together to make this atmosphere where people just don't think about the fact that that could be very upsetting for a mixed race person to hear it constantly taken the piss out of.
Yeah, it's one of those things where it's really frustrating. And you bring this up a lot in our chat. We have secret meetings. Anyway.
The council.
Where you talk about like the mechanization of race and the mechanization of being mixed race as a part of that. And, I keep struggling with that because part of me is like, with all of these third-party supplements that Sonya is talking about and anything that deals with race with regards to D&D specifically, the Big Dragon game, has to. Because of the way that the game is structured, it's almost like you'd have to break down systems of the game and leave yourself at a mechanical disadvantage if you don't engage with it. But it is frustrating. Like on one hand, it's like I get people trying to fix it within the confines of the system. On the other hand, we're not analyzing the fact that this system exists on top of this game and it's completely unnecessary. We need to understand in this context, what is a fantasy race? Why are we using this terminology? Okay. If it's not a species where we're talking about completely alien beings who are wildly biologically dissimilar versus, fantasy races with the connotation of that word in our modern lexicon, what it means, what it does. I think it's pretty telling that like I have my D&D game, right? And it utilizes that sort of stuff like elf and an orc, biased, obviously. But in my other home game, I just use a completely different system. I'm running a fantasy game in like Cortex. Okay. There are no racial systems in Cortex. That doesn't come up. Race, species, whatever. And we have a group where it's not just humans, playing. And so the question that I keep getting, and I want to pose this to the group as well. If you remove the mechanical race system in D&D, okay, and I'm asking this question because I think you already know the answer. Why would a player even want to play the orc or the elf or the goblin or the whatever in that game if there's not a mechanical incentive to do so? Now, personally, in my home game, I have people playing that because regardless of the mechanical incentive, they just wanted to do it. It's fantasy world. They want to engage with that. So what do you all think about that?
I'm going to say, as someone who's not played, like I've only played one long-term character that I can talk more about in a bit, but my sense has been that the race of my character hasn't really made that much of a difference. It's more class. Like a lot of the stuff that happens is through class, and I don't know how much race factors into it, but I also chose a race from Unearthed Arcana, so it's not as set, it's not as developed in a lot of ways, I think, which is partly why it was appealing. I didn't have to read through a whole bunch of stuff, and there was more room for me to do like what I wanted with the character. But I don't know, that's just my impression as someone who is not as immersed in a lot of the mechanics and the background stuff.
I think that, so I totally get where you're coming from, Kimchi, because I have found the kind of the so right now 5th edition is there, Volo's Guide to Monsters, the lore in there, Mordenkainen's Tomb of Foes. A lot of the lore regarding races has kind of been wiped away in favor of the new Tasha's rules, which are basically official, how you should play the game. Assign your ability scores however you want. And I like that, but I also feel that to a certain extent, it's also kind of throwing away a lot of lore that doesn't necessarily that needs to be rewritten and reformatted in a way that works within the confines of the Dragon game. The Dragon game encourages you to play races because of certain mechanical benefits. There's a difference between having a mechanical benefit that might stem from a race's culture or practices versus, oh, you're an orc, you take a -2 to intelligence. Like, I think what we need to do is specifically in D&D, need to kind of move away from this framework where bioessentialism is reinforcing the ability boosts and the ability decreases that a race gets, and start delving more into things regarding culture, and that requires a complete rewrite of the expectations and the lore in some cases of the game. And I think that's probably what we're going to see in 6th edition. So I mean, I play a lot of I run a lot of Pathfinder 2nd edition, and there is more nuance in the character creation system, just through simple things like for half elves and half orcs, they are included as heritages under the human section, but they say you don't have to be a human to have like a half orc baby or a half elf baby. You can be another race. And then they have this thing called versatile heritages, where it's like any ancestry can be an Aasimar or a tiefling or a changeling. You can be a gnome tiefling. You don't have to solely be kind of like the tiefling in 5e, which has horns and is red and has a tail. You can manifest that mixed race connection with devil kind through any flair of your character in order to make it more yours. And I think that's kind of where I hope D&D might move towards in later editions, just adding more nuance and not being bound to this whole idea that, oh, I'm going to play an orc, therefore I have to be stronger because biologically that is in my DNA.
Yeah, like, because if we move further away from the bioessentialist stuff, then it will be for the better, because like oftentimes, like kind of going back to what Izza said, like in terms of like mixed race characters also being jokes, and kind of tying in a little bit to what Jeremy was mentioning. Another thing I often see is if the mixed race character is not a joke, they are specifically designed as a mixed race character to be the strongest. They pick the best traits from one parent and the other parent And basically they make a fucking super soldier to break the DM's game, which gives me a little bit of some eugenics vibes of just like, I'm going to pick the best traits from this thing. I'm going to pick the best traits from this thing. I'm like, oh, honey, repeat what you just said several times and think about it for a second.
And it's always white people.
It's always white people.
Yeah.
And then, or like on the other hand, like, and I know this really sounds strange coming from me because I am an artist, I am a character designer. I want to make my characters look cool. Another reason why people sometimes make mixed race characters is for pure aesthetic reasons, which makes me think of like, ooh, mixed race babies are so cute. I'm like, no, stop. And just like, and I know that sounds strange coming from me as a character designer and illustrator, but like, it's the language and the carelessness that people toss these terms out. And just, I think it does have a lot to do with just, again, the mechanization of these things and how, if we like, I actually didn't know that about Pathfinder, and I actually really enjoy that kind of like how they handle that. And I actually kind of going to look into that like after this, but yeah.
For me, a lot of things that tackle bioessentialism and try to conquer that demon inside of the RPG world just fumbles right into cultural essentialism, and people don't understand kind of the negative connotations that can come into that. You know, it's like, if we were to say real world style, well, if you pluck anyone from anywhere in the world and put them in China, they're suddenly good at math. Like when you put it into those terms, you can see, well, that has nothing to do with their biology, but you're still making assumptions, racist assumptions about a person's culture. Okay. I use my brother and I as an example. Okay. I'm terrible at math. I'm a lawyer. I don't use math. When do I use math? Right. My background is in rhetoric. It's in discussion. It's negotiation. I'm really good at that stuff. Right. That's what I do all day, every day. He is literally a math professor. He's phenomenal at math. It has nothing to do with his cultural background. It has nothing to do with his racial background. It is literally his job. Okay. And if we look at what makes us who we are in an aptitude sort of sense, what are we skilled at? What can we do well? And things like that. Like, the reason why I can use chopsticks is not because I was born Korean. It's because I have practiced my whole life. Right. So there is, to me, this fine line, and it goes into what Issa was saying, you know, mechanizing culture and mechanizing race, almost like, it's almost as bad when we try to do that, you know? So if we were to say something like, orcs are really good with axes, or dwarves are really good with hammers, it sounds benign. It's just a cultural thing, but there is going to be people in an orcish society or a dwarf society that have never lifted a hammer in their lives. Okay. And I think I don't know. Part of me thinks there's almost too much baggage surrounding culture and race to try to mechanize any part of it. And we should just fall back into like, why is education and occupation not your skills? Mm-hmm. Why do we not consider those types of things? You know, it's I don't know. It's I think it's an interesting topic to tackle, and I don't know if I've seen anybody do it really, really well. I've seen some really good attempts, but I don't know if I've seen.
I think there's like a fine line. Like, when I think of culture, like I guess I'm not thinking of, all dwarves can use axes because that's just a thing in their culture. I think there's a way to do it there, and I think that's what I was thinking of in my brain. But I think it's really hard because you need to break away from that culture essentialism sort of mindset.
That's the thing, is like, because of D&D's history with mechanizing race and where that stems from in fantasy media in general, you get a lot of this like Planet of Hats stuff where it's like, well, they're a dwarf, so they are like this, as opposed to people being allowed to be varied and diverse from one another, even within their own culture. And I feel like, as much as we can try to improve upon the issues with race in D&D, I feel like no matter what, ultimately we are only able to go so far, because it's still going to be mechanizing race to an extent, and therefore it's going to lead to issues. Like mechanizing race essentially incentivizes people to treat being mixed race as like a grab bag of mechanical advantages and personality traits. If they are not someone who has like thought much more deeply into it than that. And even people who have thought deeply into it can fall into that pitfall because the game is incentivizing it, I think. And, you know, like I said earlier, like I've drifted away from D&D and come back to it with the thought of like, well, I'll just do what I want with it. And I'm very happy doing that within my own games, but that doesn't mean that that's what everybody else is doing. And I find it very interesting that when I did drift away from D&D, the system I went to at the time was Quest, which is a system I still love. And I went to that system not only because I felt like it was very streamlined, very dyslexic friendly, very accessible in general, but also because there's no race. Mechanically, there's no race. You pick your I think role is what they call it in that game. I can't quite remember now. You pick your class and everything is based on that. And in terms of the way your character looks and their culture and everything, you just decide that for yourself. And it seems so silly to just be like, well, the solution is just not to have race mechanized. Like that seems like duh, obviously. But like it was very freeing because I feel like games, because D&D is the big one and D&D mechanizes race, people feel like they have to an extent a lot of the time. And to just lose that completely for like an entire campaign over like the course of a year was very freeing, where I just went like, okay, well, my character is from this city, which is very heavily Arab coded. She's a brown-skinned woman. She happens to have pointed ears, but that doesn't really matter. Like, she's not an elf. She's just a person with pointed ears because I thought it looked cool kind of thing. Was actually very freeing. But then coming back to D&D, I felt like it also gave me some tools with which to think more deeply about the way in which D&D mechanizes race and how to do away with some of that for myself in my own games.
It's funny because it's like, it's completely arbitrary, you know. Why is race mechanized? Why is education, like I said, not something that we track? Why is training or apprenticeship not something that we necessarily track in a mechanical way in the game? What we do mechanize and what we don't mechanize are all choices that are made. And they're arbitrary choices that are made by the designers. Gygax and Arneson, way back when, decided to mechanize race. Okay? There is no obligation that we have in this day and age to follow that in D&D or otherwise. I've played tons of games where race has never come up as an issue and it's not mechanized. You know, I've played games where it's just modern world, maybe with a twinge of fantasy or with a little bit of cyberpunk or a spy game or zombies or whatever. And, you know, my characters will be of certain, you know, cultural, ethnic, skin color, whatever. And it's not a mechanical thing. So, I mean, it's one of those things where, you know, we should be asking ourselves in the design process of these games and future games, what are we going to mechanize and why are we going to do it? Why we're choosing the specific things that we're choosing to mechanize.
I think also part of the issue is, you know, going back even to like Tolkien, right, is the conflation of race and culture, right? That you have the Dwarven Kingdom, you have the elves, you know, you have the humans, or you have a couple different humans, you know, and it's just this idea of like, there's, you know, throughout all of human history, there's absolutely no way that it's impossible that there's this idea that if you are of a certain race or ethnicity, you must therefore be of a very, very specific culture. You know, people have a tendency to pick up their bags and walk places. You know, they have a tendency to go everywhere. And so this idea that, because we see it in the mechanization of these races in D&D and in other fantasy games, where some of those mechanics have really nothing to do with even bioessentialism. They have everything to do with culture. So they've kind of mashed it all together, and you have to try to extricate that in the process of trying to deliberate on what to mechanize or what not to mechanize, which also becomes a huge issue, because that becomes sort of the default of what everyone assumes. And the issue with when that becomes the default is when you get into things like how Wizards' new sort of, I guess, modus operandi is to just delete text as opposed to writing better or new text, or writing options for, like, GMs, for instance. They go off of what they understand, and almost everyone understands Tolkien, right?
Yeah.
Almost everyone understands things like that, and so they're going to start building the exact same thing that we just deleted.
Yeah.
Which is a huge issue.
What
Something-
options?
sorry.
Isa. I was gonna ask, building off of what Drew just said. What options, more options, make things perhaps a little bit better? Because I feel like that might be what D&D might be moving towards in the future. Instead of saying you automatically get these stat boosts because you're a dwarf or an orc, whatever, presenting you with presenting you with a whole bunch of different things that you can choose, or like your culture might encompass these various feats that you can pick from or whatever. Would that make things better, or just still be too rigidly defined within the framework of mechanizing culture and race?
Personally, I would say I would like to see it as a system where, you have sort of those floating 2 stat bonuses that you can choose to do with whatever you want, and that can absolutely reflect things like training or occupation rather than some sort of strange bioessentialist norm. And then, honestly, I personally would love the idea, and I know that there are folks who have absolutely implemented this or have created products about this, is have a point value system. Yeah. Where you have different, basically, features or mechanics that you can purchase for your character, and you can talk with your GM about, like, okay, what would be appropriate for this culture? And your GM can go, okay, well, based on these sort of focuses, here's a list of options, and you can kind of combine that with the background. You can kind of create this much more open-ended system that can please both those people that really want to min-max, as well as those that want to more accurately represent the idea that they're trying to put forward for their character. When we talk about things like what we're talking about, there's that side of the audience that pushes back because of race or bioessentialism, because they either want these things or they don't really understand the issue. But something that they can also understand is that it's just more options. D&D players love options. This is just more options.
I do wonder if putting the Otis on the the GM is like, I always, that's one thing I do struggle with in 5th edition. A lot of things are kind of hand waved and are like, talk with your GM or work with your GM about this, and that's my only problem with something like that. And that's where I think the fine line kind of, at least for me, exists between how much does the system itself define such and such a race's culture or backgrounds or traditions, versus how much you want to just say, leave it up to your dungeon master. Because there are instances where I might make a character where I really want mixed race heritage to be reflected in the abilities and the feats that I've chosen, but my dungeon master just doesn't get it, and therefore I can't do anything that actually gets to the heart of what I want in my mind. That is the struggle for me.
Yeah, I think a big sorry.
Okay.
A big part of it is also we have the mechanical side of it, and then we also have the lore side of it. And I've noticed, I had pointed out to me recently by someone that they were talking about the Critical Role like setting books and the way they treat half orcs, half elves being mixed race in general. And these were the books where I remember, I haven't like read them cover to cover and all that, but I remember when they came out, people saying, oh, Matt Mercer took away the -2 to intelligence that orcs get. Yeah. So therefore he's fixed orcs. That was the narrative, I remember. And then someone sent me screenshots from the book of the way in which in the lore, orcs and half orcs are talked about. And I was actually horrified. and again, it's that thing from before of like, I wasn't shocked because it's something I've seen a million times before, but I was shocked because I had seen people talking so positively about these books and saying, well, they took away the mechanical disincentivization to play an orc of a particular class. But then in the lore text, it has things about how half-orcs are born out of sexual assault and how half-orcs aren't accepted by particular sides of their family, and refers to them with language like savages and stuff like that. And so it's just the same. I can't remember because they sent me the screenshots out of context, but it might be Exandria or it might be a different one.
Wildmount book, yeah.
Or it could be Wildmount. I think the screenshots were actually from multiple books. But yeah, it was the same shit again and again. And people had been praising this because it took away a little mechanical disincentivization.
It's like,
but the lore was still awful, and that needs to change if people's attitudes towards the way they make their characters are going to change. Because if they read that lore and see that same shit again,
it reinforced.
It reinforces it. But if they see new ways to approach the idea of an orc culture or an orc person, an individual or a half orc in the text, then it will actually make them stop and think.
I think Eberron's orcs are better than most in D&D because they do present them as a far cry from, the barbarians and savages that are in so many other settings. I mean, Critical Role, for all of its, good things, it's still rooted in D&D lore. It's still rooted in like 4th edition specifically.
The changing of the orcs, and it's like they removed the bonuses, but they still have the language. It's like, we changed it from mongrel men to mongrel folk, guys.
It's gender inclusive racism. Yay!
Thank you, Betty.
Gender inclusive racism. I gotta steal that one. That's too good.
But this is something I've been thinking about a lot. Is this idea of like, you can change the mechanics, but if you don't change the flavor text, if you don't change the lore, you're not doing anything. You're just...
It's icing on the shit cake.
Yeah.
Eventually you're going to still get the shit.
Or what some people call polishing a turd.
Yes.
Well, and I think from my point of view, or my, I guess, anecdote, to put it this way, a -2 has never affected how I felt during a session. How I was portrayed, or how experiences similar to me were portrayed in a session based on lore, has absolutely dictated how I felt about a session. I have, over the course of making a character, seen, bioessentialism and been like, nah, like this is really, this is very frustrating for me. But once I get into play, it is the lore, it is the world in which I'm supposed to reside for the next 3-4 hours. Yeah. That is what dictates how I end up feeling.
Yeah, the assumptions that other people at the table make about the character you've chosen to play. So like, it's a small minor example, but I at one point played a half orc, half earth genasi wizard, who I love very much. She's an adorable archaeologist. She gets very excited about cool rocks.
We got 2 archaeologists here, so it's like, hey, rocks, nice.
And I wanted her to be this like very joyful, very intellectual, joyful character who finds a lot of happiness in her like academic pursuits. And I made a point of, when I described her, as saying she's quite slim, slender, her clothes look like they're a bit too big for her, like they're maybe hand-me-downs. And people just kind of ignored that. And at one point someone was like, I'm going to stand behind the big orc lady while this person is threatening me. And I was like, but I specifically described her as slim and slender and short
and small
and not buff. Yeah. And it's a small thing, but it made me think about the fact that the way in which I had very deliberately tried to undercut the stereotype was ignored, even when I made a point of doing it. And people still slipped into the stereotype of, well, she's an orc, she's a wizard, but she's still got to be buff because she's a half orc, right?
A wizard, yes.
Why would you stand
I'm not
the
saying
wizard,
there's anything wrong with
I know, right?
Like that would be cool.
Yeah,
but that wasn't what I was playing.
And on a piece of paper, come on.
That's really weird. If you know that she's a wizard, like, still, why would you stand behind it? That is weird. That is some weird racism, like weird subconscious racism going on.
It was entirely subconscious, I'm sure, but it just it was a very stark but small example to me of how even when you try to subvert the expectations, there's so much work you have to do to subvert them. You can't like
Yeah.
It's like it has to do with like I could like with my air, like for example with my air gymnastics, I could like have the element of like a little bit got picked on for being different for as a kid, but I make it a point in her story that she is so much more than her trauma. It does inform some of her personality traits and whatnot, but she's so much more than that. She loves her family. Their family owns a business. Her and her dad teach like fitness and self-defense classes. Her mom runs a cafe. Their family is in a bunch of money trouble, so she does underground wrestling / fighting at night on every other weekend. She is a masked wrestler.
Don't we all?
Yes. average Saturday night, but she's so much more than her trauma. But if you're like in the wrong circles, or the people are just so entrenched in those like past stereotypes, they could still completely forget it, no matter how much you try to drive the point home. Like, no, they're not like this. There can still be a little bit of undercurrent of this that they're not willing to mentally let that go, and it has to do with again the emotional labor and just trying to freaking unscrew that shit.
Yeah. In fact, sorry, Kimchi.
It's just every time that you try to include something like that, someone tries to be a smart ass or try to hold on to the ancient whatever.
You could call it ancient.
It's the Tolkien-esque lore, and and we'll fight tooth and nail to keep that. You brought up the Black Elves previously, and all that. When that came out, and I've been doing a lot of research on like POCs throughout specifically European history. Because of that, I was like, this is not a thing. And there were Black Africans in England prior to the Anglo-Saxon migration. So before Anglo-Saxons came and made up the Anglo-Saxon population of England, Black people were there. So like it's so frustrating, this mentality that POC didn't exist before 1600. Like we just emerged from the ether.
No, that Black people didn't exist before civil rights. Come on,
the earth split open, and then suddenly,
in 1945, the Windrush arrived in Britain, and that's when all people of color arrived.
Yeah,
it wasn't 1945, but whatever.
But it's so weird to me that you get pushback by trying to introduce POC characters into what may or may not be a predominantly white European-esque setting. Who cares if it's a predominantly white European-esque setting? People travel.
Yeah.
Like
people move.
The idea of POC in Europe is literally in my DNA, being Spanish.
Same.
We did the whole DNA testing and stuff like that, and it's like 1 in 10 people in Spain have North African genetics. Okay, descended from the the Umayyad Caliphate or the Caliphate of Cordoba and all the subsequent. I don't want to use an archaic term because it might be offensive to modern sensibilities, because the historic stuff. But basically, that North African conquest of Spain, and I am one of those. So my ancestors colonized my ancestors, who then later rebelled, and then those ancestors colonized my other ancestors, who then later. Anyway, it's complicated.
Being mixed race,
but
fun.
Stacks on stacks.
Yeah.
But yeah, it shows this lack of understanding of actual history.
Like
when
people have been there the whole
try
time.
to claim, when people try to claim, well, this setting is based on some European country or some amalgamation of European countries, therefore there can be people of color there.
Way.
I'm just like, have you not heard of the Moors? You need to sit down and shut up and go read something about the Moors, like immediately. Go read about Cordoba in Spain, a city where like Spanish Catholics, Jewish people, and Moorish Muslims all lived together, very integrated up until the Inquisition came along, and we know what happened there. But like, there is literally a mosque in Cordoba, this huge, beautiful mosque, and when all the Muslims were expelled from Spain, they built a church inside it. Like, you can literally see the blending of cultures, not done in like a nice way, but it's there. Like, it's like the architecture of the city has Muslim architecture integrated into it. Like,
it's not just picked aesthetic, it has cultural and historical precedence as to why it's there. They didn't just put it there because it's pretty.
Yep.
And the same folks that want to, almost willfully not believe this or not want to entertain these ideas are also the same people that'll pick up their mic and go like, well, in 1021 AD, the Vikings got to America, and it's like you're telling me that's cool. Like, that's fine. You know what I'm saying?
Choosing through history.
It's always, it is a big deal and totally believable and should be a part of the everyday when white people go somewhere.
Because white people, of course, would have the advanced boat technology to get that far, and no people of color ever did that.
The Vikings went to America and brought them air conditioning. Like, it's whatever sort of bullshit they always come up with.
In general, just as go and do some research, but you will probably find in almost every place of the world that the drawing of lines based on something like race or even racialized culture or whatever is a lot more recent than you think. Because in Japan, there's that overall narrative of the Japanese ethnic majority, whatever. But this idea of xenophobia or fear of racial mixture and all of that, it's really recent. And now modern times, not as strong as some outsiders would like to think. It's a lot more complicated, and you kind of have to look into it and not just make that assumption that people have always distinguished each other and separated each other based on certain parameters.
Like the concept of the ethnostate. Okay. The idea that you would have a monochromatic kingdom of Gondor or the Elven kingdom at all is a little odd in the historical context.
Yeah.
Okay. And you don't need to go into some sort of agrarian society to find, these people were just moving around. No, like the classics era and medieval eras, and I'm using the Western definitions for that because, Western education, but those eras are just littered with all of these different nations who were multi-ethnic as we would currently consider it. Okay. The Romans and their empire, the Mongols and their empire, the Huns who, spanned both continents as well. Little figures in history that were so significant before they were literally whitewashed out of history by Renaissance European historians like Saint Maurice. Sorry, I'm going on a little tangent because I've been doing this thing for the video. I'm going to be releasing soon. But Saint Maurice, whose name literally means dark-skinned, Maurice is that's what it means, was a Black African Roman centurion who had a legion in France and in the French area, what we would now call France, right? And he died there. And there's he's a hero. He's a saint in the Catholic Church. There's an abbey to Saint Maurice in, I want to say somewhere in that area. It may not be modern France, but somewhere in that area. And his whole troop was there. And they were all from a Black community in Egypt. This was always happening in all of these great empires that you know about. Okay. But when you watch something like the TV show Rome or Spartacus, and it's just less so Spartacus. They were actually a little better about that. But
there's people of color in there.
And you see this just whitewashed empire. Okay.
They don't even want to portray ancient Greeks and Romans as being olive-skinned. They're just so pasty. It's can we at least get some olive-skinned Greeks up in here? We can't even
put
have
these
that.
actors in the sun, please.
Brad Pitt just doesn't look Greek to me.
No. But that's the thing. We get this really fixed, homogenous view of the ways in which race has been in the real world in Europe, and then D&D and the majority of TTRPGs and fantasy media bases their worlds upon that, but doesn't actually base it upon the accurate historical knowledge, bases it upon the media that preceded it, which was whitewashed. And so it's whitewashed media preceded by whitewashed media, preceded by whitewashed media. And so we end up with this really rigid idea of what race and ethnicity means in a fantasy setting, asterisk European fantasy setting. And like,
for a second, I thought you were talking about the comic book asterisks. Like, I was a kid.
I have like some of the recent fantasy shows that have portrayed a more multicultural society. Like The Witcher has its faults, but I do like how there's people of color in there.
I was very excited when I saw that kid and he took off his hat and he was a black elf. I'm like, finally!
A lot of people have objected to. There's a major objection to the show is that it's basically like Yennefer is not white and doesn't look like how she looks in the games and stuff like that. And you know, this usually runs concurrent with the idea that like the Witcher Netflix show has wiped away all the Polish flavor from the series, which I can kind of see. But if you're using that argument to say like, why are there black elves? Then that's where I start to disagree with you.
Yeah.
And then there's also like another series, which does have its flaws, but I've liked it for its portrayal of mixed race people, is The Wheel of Time, because most of the major characters in there are mixed race. And that was really fun for me to see as a viewer, to see how they took these characters that were probably, you know, meant to be white in the original books and then transpose them into a setting where they're almost all played by mixed race actors. And the series has also gotten a lot of flack for that too, which once again reinforces the effect that older fantasy media has had on generations.
Yeah.
It's just like, why does that ruin it for you?
I haven't watched Wheel of Time and I haven't read the books, don't really know anything about it.
It's got its problems, but I do recommend it for watching mixed race people play important pivotal characters.
Yeah, I think like obviously hearing about Shadow and Bone, which we touched on last time, and then watching The Witcher, which literally I ended up hate watching it with my partner. We watched all the way until in the end of season 2, and I was just like, I fucking hate this show.
You went through all of it. Like I like it. You hate watch that many episodes.
Yeah, I know, right? It's a lot. I know.
That's a lot to hate watch.
I got a really bad injury in January, and I was kind of bedridden for a bit. So I was just like, I'm just gonna lie here and seethe watching this show. And
just rewatch Warrior, okay?
The Warrior thing that struck me was just like, okay, so you in some of these modern series, they're clearly aware that fantasy is very white, very Eurocentric, and they are trying to be more diverse. But usually the showrunners are white, or it's mostly white people. And so the way they do that is to just kind of go like, well, it's still European fantasy, but there's a black guy and a mixed race woman, and there you go, and people are racist to elves. And so they're still repeating the same problems. The same lore is there, but they've changed the surface
I think it comes from
mechanics.
like adapting older media, adapting older media and trying to do it in a 21st century lens, which therein comes the disconnect, because you're going to always have that group being like, how dare you make these people that I imagined as white non-white, versus the original intent of the author, which was, to create a story in a Eurocentric setting, versus, how you might want to make a more multicultural depiction of a story today. You have these three clashing viewpoints that are always going to cause a little volcano eruption.
I try to be a little bit more forgiving for this sort of thing, because like we are not the audience for that diversity. We know better. The audience for that diversity is trying to get the spoonful of sugar to let the medicine go down. So when we see that sort of thing, I keep thinking to myself, this is not for me. This is not for me to feel included. This is not for me to feel represented. This is for the white audience to get used to the idea of seeing someone that looks kind of like me on screen in their fantasy, so we can get past.
So sad.
So we can get
spoon
past
feeding a child, like here's the airplane.
It's getting past the Lord of the Rings. It's getting past the Wheel of Time and The Witcher and all this sort of stuff, so we can like throw in some N.K. Jemisin and actually get some stuff in there. It's like because the book world of fantasy, while still having its issues, I think has far surpassed visual media like television movies. And I know that there are some deals to get adaptations to some of that work, but a lot of that hinges on the financial viability of these quote unquote classics and titans of the genre from getting done. And it is sad. It is frustrating. It's being told yet again, the time isn't right and they're not ready.
Yeah.
Which
Another
is
thing I've
when will you be ready?
Another thing
now.
I've noticed with these series that are like adapting something that's thought of as like white and European and then adding some POC characters into it is that POC characters get added in very particular places as very particular roles.
Yeah.
So like Yennefer has this story that revolves, she's played by a mixed race actress. Her being mixed race in terms of how the actress is actually mixed race is not the way in which the mixed race portrayal is bad. It's the fantasy. She is part elf and therefore discriminated against shit. But she goes through all this pain, and the character is also disabled, and there's a whole ableist curing narrative and all that shit. Yennefer's pretty awful, like for gender, race, and
actually not
ableism.
in the books entirely.
Like, oh, really?
The arc in the TV show has been created to flesh her out more, and it's been created with good intentions. But I definitely see where you're coming from.
Yeah, but yeah. So this character who goes through a lot of pain and ostracization and othering and marginalization, she gets to be a person of color. And then we have other characters, say like the couple of black characters that you see around, like Fringilla, and characters whose names I can't remember because they're not mentioned enough and I didn't pay enough attention. But like you get like the black royal guardsman who dies, and you get the black elf who barely speaks, and at first you think he might not even be able to speak. And then there's another black elf who is literally deaf and can't speak and then dies, and Fringilla who turns out to be evil. And it's just,
they get
even
slotted
when
into
they're adding
the
diversity,
roles.
yeah, it's either characters who are disposable, characters who are in servitude, or characters who have to go through a lot of pain.
Yeah, I've seen that a lot with particularly Into the Badlands, which I still haven't seen the final season, even though my man Louis Tan is in it. I'll get to it eventually. But like in the first season, I really, really enjoyed it because it was like focused on, MK and Sunny and their story. And I really liked it because there was a interracial relationship between Sunny and Vale. And it was like, oh, this is great. The second season, I started noticing that like a lot of the characters that were the ones doing the heavy lifting and the heavy suffering and getting beat up the most or just mentally tortured were all people of color, while all the white characters were just perfectly fine getting the big narrative sweeps. And then by the end of the second season, like I was just like watching it, I'm not going to spoil it, but I was like, don't do the thing I know you want to do. Don't fucking do that. Oh, you did it. I'm out.
I
You did the thing.
I struggle with this a lot in the comic book world and in comic book movies. Like I just watched the Batman the other day. Commissioner Gordon is portrayed as black. Jeffrey Wright does an awesome job. But yeah, you'd make Commissioner Gordon black, but I don't think we're ever going to see a black Batman on screen. There is often this concession that we will make the side characters POC.
Yeah. And very
Supergirl
particularly,
TV series.
actually. Yeah.
Supergirl TV series, Jimmy Olsen black. I mean, sure,
Yeah.
fine. That's great, but like you're like giving us these little things around the edges. And like Kimchi said, I think it's not for us. I think it's fine in a way, but I do also struggle with getting annoyed at the fact that, even in the comic book world, you have things like, there's like a black Batman now in the comic books, but he's not like the main Batman. And Daniel in our chat brought up the Batwoman show, which is a black Batwoman, but that was also a recasting. And it feels like, oh, the white Batwoman left. And so now we're bringing in this side character. And that's probably one of the more prominent examples that I've seen, but almost always it's kind of these tertiary characters or recasts or, we've given the idea a chance to settle. So now let's introduce, the spice that is the person of color.
And even like, again, Daniel has brought up Miles Morales in our chat. Everyone here loves Miles Morales. Miles Morales is great.
Yeah.
Into the Spider-Verse, amazing movie. But is Miles Morales considered the main Spider-Man?
He's considered the side Spider-Man, and he's considered the Brooklyn Spider-Man.
Yeah.
And a lot of people who read his comics object to the fact that he kind of goes through a lot of the same narrative arcs that Peter Parker has gone through. And they're like, I mean, he's a great character, but it is an issue, I think.
Yeah. And very specifically, I just want to mention, because you talked about the Batman, which I haven't seen, didn't know that a black actor had been cast to play Commissioner Gordon. But there is a trend with casting, sorry, just hit my microphone. There is a trend with casting POC actors into particular roles, as you said, these tertiary or secondary or tertiary side characters. And there's a very particular thing in American media specifically where there are particular roles that are allowed to be fulfilled by black actors. And the black police chief is one of them.
Black cop, the tech nerd, these things that you see them fall into. And I think it's not a bad thing, but I think it is a sign of perhaps a lack of creativity or almost a concessional mindset, and almost a sign that we still have a long way to go before.
Such a long
like,
way to go.
like Kimchi said, we get to a world where, Batman or James Bond or whoever could be played by a person of color, and the world will not crap their pants. And I mean, the world couldn't even deal with a blonde dude, Daniel Craig, playing James Bond. Like, good God! So I mean, even though or Robert Pattinson being cast as Batman, even though now he's getting praised to high health. So good God,
Yeah.
Imagine if an Asian actor was put in that role.
We have some time left, and something I just thought of is I would like to talk about. We've talked about like our own characters and stuff. I'd kind of like to circle back to that because we've just talked about critiquing more media representations of people of color and mixed race people. And I would kind of like to circle back to like our own creations a bit. And because the topic of this was supposed to be how we represent ourselves, and then we just went off, which is fine because that's what always happens. We have grievances that need to be aired. And when we were talking about D&D, we were talking about this idea of culture versus race versus mechanics versus law. And I know that I've been working on something that like I feel okay to talk about where I'm very specifically trying to make a D&D supplement that will sort of be a form of like hopefully altering some of that in the way that like Genasia portrayed. But before I go off, I would like to see if anyone else would like to go off about like your own characters, your own worlds that you've GM'd, anything like that.
Sure. So for me, I don't really have that many examples. And I remember saying in our group chat, like, that's a whole other story. That's a whole other thing. It's like, why don't we, or why don't I, try to play those kinds of like mixed characters. But one character I tried to play, or still am, I've been playing him for over 3 years now. He is level 17 from level 1, so we're doing all right for ourselves. But he's very busted. But I had decided from day one, because I'm always like this about things, I'm not going to ease into it. I'm just going to deep dive, but I decided to deep dive into like more of like how I felt in terms of trauma. Because, I think on the outside, I have always been, I grew up being like one of three Asian kids that I knew. And so it was always, for me, very much a badge of honor. It made me different from people. And because of that, people paid attention to me, which I liked, But this was sort of my way of exploring the negative side of it, the parts that kind of hurt or made me feel different in a bad way. Like any, I think TTRPG player, there's a risk of me talking and then it won't stop. So to be very specific about an event and talking about when playing a mixed character like that went wrong, where it didn't go well. And in this particular case, my character had lost his powers. He was in a big upset and lost what he was able to do, and through a quest got it back, but got back a much more powerful version of it. Basically started to get on the road to godhood, which is what all of the characters are on now. And when he absorbed that power, this is probably important to say, the character's a tiefling, so already I was like, the morality of being mixed, like the morality of being different was a huge thing, and how people perceive you if they perceive your existence as being evil, because in the setting, everyone's basically kind of chill with each other except for tieflings. Everybody hates tieflings, which is problematic, but we had all previously agreed to it, right? We had agreed that this was something that we wanted to talk about. And when I absorbed all that power as a character, I was asked to describe how it went, and I was kind of prompted by the GM to do this. I described myself as no longer a tiefling. And the person I described in their place, after all of the impurity or the evil was shed, was basically like Clark Kent, just very chiseled, sort of Superman-ish kind of figure. And it didn't sit well with me. Something about it just didn't sit well. And I was trying to figure that out over the next few weeks. And I was talking to the GM, and I started to realize, oh, because in my brain, tiefling for me is my heritage. And that's the way I interact in the setting with my own mixed experience. And I just fixed myself. All the things that hurt, all the things that, caused me pain, I got rid of by becoming someone different. Instead of, telling the world to move, I moved. I changed myself. And didn't like that, real uncomfortable. I realized, I think in that moment, how deeply ingrained whiteness was in terms of how I interacted with my own that kind of experience, because everything around me is by and large white. All of the, people that I'm told are supposed to be attractive are white. All of the heroes are white. Even, the villains, by and large, are oftentimes white. And so that's what I went with in terms of my character. And it just didn't feel good. So like that's an example of it going wrong. Now, thankfully, we had a point, because I have a great GM. Shout out to Gabe. That we brought it back around, and at a later point, I, as a character, made the conscious decision to go back, to reverse that process, because how am I supposed to expect the world to change and be better and accept what it is if I don't also do that myself, right? And so he went back, and it was a very, very cathartic experience. So overall, went very well, very positive. But yeah, I wanted to bring that up because that's an example of like, when you get in too deep, with the trauma, and you take it a little too far, and it just doesn't go the way you would want it to.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So
because you don't realize it, but you just wind up unpacking, like you said, you didn't realize you were doing it, but it's so baked in you that somehow this winds up coming out, and then you sit like 2 sessions later, like, oh wait, no, there's a reason for this.
Yeah.
Like the conspiracy board pops up and the threads all connect, and you're like, I got it, I connected the dots, holy fuck.
Yeah, but it was also like, it was in many ways a solo experience, because like some other folks I talked about earlier, like for me, all of my GMs have, except for Daniel, been white. But beyond that, they have been white, surrounded by white. Like for most of my friends, I'm the only person of color at all that they are personally friends with, so I am the gateway to all experiences, for them. I'm the spokesperson for everybody, apparently.
That's a lot.
But there's no one to know to check in on me, because of what happens, because that happened. And no one else was able to be cognizant, because they have simply, in that case, no experiences that would help them to key into my own uncertainty, or that I just did something that I probably actually didn't like, because they would have no notion to watch out for that kind of thing. For them, it's just good story, which it was good story, but it was
there was
probably
a bit of a cost. Yeah,
it was more traumatic than I had expected to be.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I'm glad that they listened to you when you brought it up, because
they're great. They're great white friends, but they're doing good stuff.
Oh, you just said that.
I think something I wanted to bring up earlier, which the conversation kind of moved on, and then I was like, oh, it's not really relevant anymore. But you just brought up like exploring trauma through characters. I realized with the character I mentioned earlier, Elise, who's like someone who thought she was human and then realized she was Genasi, and that was like a very big part of her story. I actually realized that I had subconsciously made it so that while, yes, there was a lot of trauma, sad backstory shit going on in her past, none of it was actually related to her being a Genasi. Like none of the trauma was racialized, which I find interesting, that even though I feel like I did like edit some things about the story, I very much, even when not consciously thinking about it, tried to edge away from making the fact that she was mixed race coded traumatic for her, and that discovering she was a Genasi was actually a source of like interest and joy because it explained things about her that she hadn't understood before. And as I mentioned before, I've played that character at a table where I wasn't allowed to explore the breadth of that character, and in fact had that storyline kind of co-opted away from me by white people. But now getting to play that character at a table where I feel very safe and very comfortable and feel like the character is very celebrated, getting to really dive into a person who not only believes she is human and then discovers she's a Genasi and becomes like very immersed in trying to figure out what that means for her, but also a character who on top of that actually has a lot of like cultural trauma, but not to do with being a Genasi. It's because she was exiled from her homeland. So I've accidentally made this character, I've made this character who experiences, whose experiences growing up were being separated from her culture, which is something that I experienced growing up. But the way to explore that trauma was not through the Genasi aspect of her character. The Genasi aspect of her character was always something positive, which is something I felt was very important. And yeah, that's just something I really love about getting to play that character like to her fullest now, is like exploring all those nuances of like, this is someone who felt like they were not a part of where they came from, but then discovered this other thing about themselves that she now feels like she is a part of. And going through the whole gamut of like mixed race feelings and diaspora feelings with that one character is very interesting. And I think
it
another
can definitely be a tool.
Yeah, definitely. Like I think we should be able to explore these things through playing RPGs, but it's just something that has to be dealt with carefully and sensitively, and has to be given the same amount of care by the other people around us as we're going to put into it, because people need to understand that if someone is exploring these issues at your table, it's going to be like very personal and important to them. And it needs to be given that respect if it is at a table with a lot of other people and those people are white or not mixed race, what have you. But I think another interesting way to explore mixed identity through characters is also through the visual aspects of the characters, which Sonya brought up earlier. And I know that you and me, Sonya, have talked about like art and design, and as two people who draw and are artists and stuff. And like, I know that I have kind of battled with this idea of like presenting a character as mixed race through visual design, very specifically because, and this is something that came up in the Al-Qadim podcasts, this idea of whenever Swana and South Asian culture is represented, it's often as this like mishmash of everything thrown together very carelessly by white people. And someone brought up earlier the idea that when we do it, it's us exploring something. When white people do it, it's carelessness. And I know that specifically with Elise, her character design is one where I very thoughtfully included multiple elements of South Asian clothing, of Moroccan prop design, of like Arab clothing, and different like visual cultural elements, and kind of blended them together because that was something I wanted for the character. And I'm wondering if you have anything else to share in terms of like visual design of characters portraying their cultural identity.
Yeah, and I think it goes back again to my Air Genasi Faye. At this point, I'm just gonna be talking about Faye. She's my favorite. So Faye's family is Chinese. Like her parents are Chinese, and her and her brother are Chinese. But I code them as mixed in my head because they're Air Genasi and they're not human and whatnot. And like they're fully Chinese. Like I think me and my the player who plays my brother, their parents' face claims are Michelle Yeoh and Tom Wu. So family of badasses. But one of the things I wanted to like when I was designing her and trying to figure out her character design, because also I'm like, hey, time for a portfolio piece, let's go, was trying to figure out like, okay, how am I going to portray Faye's clothing? And because I wanted to have like, elements of like traditional Chinese clothing, but also because she's now centered and lived 90% of her life in Waterdeep, which is largely Eurocentric and a little like quote unquote modern, I guess I would put it. Like, okay, what are the parameters? And so when I designed a bunch of her outfits. I did spring, summer, fall, winter, and her like fighting wrestling gear and whatnot. And the parameters for her was like one, she has to show abs and there has to be a crop top. That is a must. Two, she doesn't like sleeves. And I wanted it specifically to be like traditional meets modern, but also avoid the stereotypical monk clothing because she is a monk class. Because, you know, when someone plays a monk, it's often like the stereotypical monk clothing that you type in monk on Pinterest, monk D&D, and they all have
hand
the
wraps
same
and a robe.
hand wraps, robe, big poofy pants with the ties on it. Like Faye has some of those elements,
the big beads,
the big beads. So I wanted to avoid this, so I started putting a bunch of stuff together for like her Pinterest board just so I can design outfits. And what I wound up ending up with is basically kind of like a mishmash kind of, and I guess it kind of I feel is a good representation of like how I portray her as mixed, is like it's traditional Chinese clothing with touches of modern stuff. So I would even see like fashion blogs where like, you know, fashion bloggers in China, they would like take traditional clothing and like make it more modernized or something like that. Have that with like Asian like traditional clothing mixed with like modern dance clothing, like we would see when like the cool dance choreo videos in like the studios and stuff. And it's usually like, you know, baggy pants, crop tops, like cut up sweaters and all that stuff. And if you look at her design, it's like pretty much like a I like to think I succeeded on it. People can look at it as like, nah, you didn't, but I think I did maybe. But like it's like a mishmash of those. So I feel like subconsciously I was trying to do like, okay, how do I portray these two things coming together to figure out this one person and how she presents herself and her background and where she currently is now. Yeah, so it's a really fun thing to do.
Having seen the character design, like I get that from it. Like,
yay!
I think you succeeded, and yeah, like for me with Elise, like I mentioned, like this idea of like a character who's wearing something that looks like a deconstructed sari, has like sort of Moroccan patterns on it as well, but then you mentioned modern clothing. I completely forgot to mention, like, I added in then elements of sort of more modern looking clothing because this character also grew up on an airship. So it's showing that while she wears elements of the like traditional clothing from the place that she comes from, she also has these like, you know, combat boots with fur, kind of like aviator looking clothing, kind of punky with like spiked gloves and stuff like that, to show that she's also on that sort of like separate from society, slightly different, like more modern looking worldview, because she's left that place behind and is like in an area of like all constantly moving forward.
Yeah, it's that visual indicator to show like, okay, here's where they were before, but also here's where they are now.
Yeah, exactly. And that can be so powerful to get to do with a character.
Especially when you finally get it, you're like, I did it! 50 drafts later.
Yeah. There's definitely the process with character design where you have to like, you have to iterate upon it a lot. And then when it all slots into place and you go like, yes, that's it. That's the combination of elements that says mixed race, Swana, South Asian, Janasi who lives on an airship.
We did it.
We did it, lads.
So you are trying to make it more complicated. Just
oh yeah, obviously.
This is us making it complicated. This is our thing.
Yeah, we're allowed to because okay. So sorry, just me and Sonya just off in our little corner talking about art and design. Like sorry.
Fascinating.
Does anyone else have any other like characters and stuff they want to talk about? Any cool like world building moments, things like that?
Well, for me, I just draw on history. I'm a huge history buff, and I feel like, as odd as it may sound, sometimes reality is the solution. Like I base a lot in my homebrew world on the ancient Roman Empire and the Mongolian Empire during the Khanate. And so, you know, you got to the Mongolian Empire where like, was it the mayor of Beijing was from Iraq at one point. The mayor of what was then, what is now Beijing, was like born and raised in Iraq, but he was part of the empire and he was really good at his job. So he just became the mayor of that area. And they're all over the place, but they are all members of this empire, right? And the Romans had this habit of taking legions from one area, like with the story of St. Maurice, and they would just pick up these groups of people that were part of the Roman Empire at that point, conquered, and they would join the legions and they would transport them halfway across the world and just plant them there. And then when their term of service had ended, they would retire and settle where they stayed. This way, they wouldn't be fighting their own people, and they would feel, Roman first, and be in a completely different area of the world. So in my world, you will find people of all different skin types, ethnicities, facial features, whatever, transplanted all over. And then they will have traces of, great grandpa was from wherever, and we still have certain things that traditionally come down from there, and maybe certain features or communities that exist inside of whatever place we're in now. But it's a sort of mishmash of culture. It's a mishmash of history, and people don't really care as much with regards to, oh, you're from that foreign land or whatever, because they trade. There's ports and people are always seeing people from the other parts of the world. Mm-hmm. So I just try to focus on that sort of, what were classics and medieval era history actually like? How did people respond to that? And use that as an example in my game.
Yeah. That's definitely something I like to try and do as well, is not have, at the very least, not have it be like, this is the place where the elves live and only the elves, and this is the place where the dwarves live and only the dwarves. Yeah. It's like the fantasy
equivalent of a middle school dance where you're just up against the walls and no one's interacting.
Yeah. Like, because that's not the way the world works. And like every city, whenever it's specifically in the campaign where I play Elise, because I get to contribute a lot of world building in this campaign, because I think players should get to contribute world building, because then they're connected to the world. It's cool. Something that we do very specifically is go like, okay, we're arriving in a new city. What are the 5 or 6 main ancestries that you're going to see here? And then there's also like a diversity of others like sprinkled throughout it, rather than going like, it's all elves, maybe one human. You go like, okay, well, we're now in a very like a sort of more deserty region, so maybe we've got a good contingency of like lizard folk and kobolds mixed in with humans and orcs and goliaths, and Aarakocra have also settled because there's like a mesa above it and stuff like that, and like basically like treating the world not as everyone living off in their separate little corners, but as everyone having come together and their cultures merging together, I think is very interesting and helps to combat some of that like very essentialist D&D world building.
Yeah, I even like including like differences between coastal city, interior city. Like the more you move away from a border, the less the influence is of who was across the border. And you see that sort of gradual fade. So there'll be points where like the players will go from one city to another. And they're like, oh, this is kind of different. It's like, yeah.
Exactly.
That is.
It's like, yeah, of course it's going to be different. Venice Beach is so much more different than downtown LA. It's a whole different, 2 different things.
Yeah. It's like, also something. Oh, sorry.
No, that's okay. Take it. Go.
No, you go ahead.
I was just gonna say, it's like, in my setting, which is very similar in regards to like everyone's everywhere. As any adventuring parties want to do, they go everywhere. They're headed to every corner of the map. If there's a dot on the map, they're gonna see it at some point. But people will notice that they're not locals, but they don't say, you look different. It's more like, oh, I noticed from your accent, which is weird because none of them actually have accents, but I would assume their characters do. but I noticed by your accent. Oh, I noticed by the way you dress. Oh, you tried to pay with a currency that I don't recognize.
Yeah.
Things like that. Ways of telling difference, but that aren't so tied to specifically like what someone's actual physical appearance is. Because if you're a bunch of humans and whatever, that's great. We got you too. There's no difference. Like everyone's everywhere for the most part.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's definitely something. Kitty!
Everyone got very
distracting.
Yeah, I was just like, I just keep talking, just power through.
Sorry, that dog is just so intensely cute. I can't handle
it. Animal.
Asians represent. We got the animal.
Oh my god, adorable.
Am I gonna have to get my cat now? Do I have to go get my cat?
I have like an empty Capri Sun pack,
Yeah, that's cute too, I guess.
I have this little fuzzy red panda that my friend got me. Cute. Does that count?
I also have a red panda.
I have a
garbage fire.
Nice.
Anyway,
so funny.
Yeah, that's definitely like my I've realized that my current approach to world building has definitely been just mix everything together because people move, and it's cool to make it make sense on like an environmental level. Like you're on a coastline, there's a bunch of Triton and water genasi, but also there's probably some humans and elves and orcs as well because people move.
And it just makes sense because like
it's just more rich.
If we have a system where a dragon can be polymorphed into a goldfish, why wouldn't there be all these people living together?
There is something real satisfying about using reality, especially the past, because I also use the past in general. My current character is a rabbit folk from what is my version of an archaeological site that like exists in real life. It was a big settlement that was a major locale of interaction for what is now Japan, Korea, Northeast Asia in general, is also down into South and Southeast Asia. Like this existed archaeologically, so why can't it exist in a fantasy world? And that's where my character comes from. Mm-hmm. And like I said, rabbit folk are relatively recent, and there isn't a lot of lore and mechanics around them. And I think that's partly why I found them super appealing.
Yeah, they don't have that baggage.
Yeah, there wasn't a lot of connotation. Even though my table is great, like I guess the DM's all right. Like Daniel's not going to call me out on whatever I want to do.
All of a sudden, you just get cut from the feed.
Yeah, I'm gone. But then,
oh boy.
But then it's the connotations there. Like it didn't matter what the table was like. I didn't want to pick a character that had that baggage or that stuff going on. So instead, I made like a rabbit folk who comes from archaeological Japan, essentially.
That's cool.
That just sounds freaking cool.
And here we are. And it's worth noting, Daniel hired someone to do character art for us, and the person happens to also be familiar with Japanese archaeology. So they automatically picked up on stuff that I didn't even write down for the character reference and gave them like period appropriate themed clothing. I was like, oh hell yeah. What? Like, I probably should have said that. It was good.
Nice.
Everybody bringing the archaeology into RPGs. Nobody bringing the lawyer stuff in.
Well, it's a political intrigue, and we all need a lawyer up. We know who we're going to call.
I did play one session. That was our characters in court in Sigil. Actually, the whole session was a whole bunch of cross examinations, and it was one of the best D&D sessions I've played.
Literally, the story arc I'm about to do.
By a lawyer. So
the story arc I'm about to do in the campaign where I play Elise is like she's finally gone back to her home city because she has to go to her mother's trial because her mother is being put on trial for the thing they got exiled for, and there's going to be a hell of a lot of lawyering happening.
Isa, you need to message me and tell me how it goes because I want to know.
If you need a technical consultant,
you bring in I would like to bring in this guest player. Kimchi will be my lawyer for my character.
I only require the Law and Order ding-dong sound to appear.
Fun fact, this character has also actually been put on trial before. So,
crimes!
There's a lot of crimes.
It's got to end in a cliffhanger and just black screen. Dun, dun, at the end.
Executive producer Dick Wolf.
I am wondering how Kimchi would feel about the way me and Nat handle like the like trials and law involved.
It's gonna be the lawyer reacts to Phoenix Wright videos.
That's not how
completely
hearsay works.
unrealistic.
What's going on here?
Oh, baby.
Yeah.
Oh, and another
So many
baby.
babies.
So many babies. Yes, the
And the
camera's on too.
Capri Sun.
Oh.
Stop.
Um,
What an asshole. Jesus.
so yeah, I did want to very briefly talk about a thing I'm working on because I feel like
Do it,
people
do
here
it, do it.
will appreciate it. Kimchi already knows about it because me and Kimchi have secret conversations.
Secret council
So many
meetings?
secrets.
secret council meetings.
That's illegal. We can't have that.
Yeah.
I'm not sure about the legality on there.
Done.
Which is that for all our talk of Genasi, which people here seem to be really into Genasi. I wonder why. It might be all the mixed race coding. The thing for me with Genasi was that I was immediately drawn to them, but also felt like they were mechanically lacking very much, and that I didn't like a lot of aspects of the lore. So what ended up happening was that every time I made a new Genasi character, I would rewrite the lore more and more, and then eventually I ended up being like, you know what, and fuck these mechanics too. I'm gonna
The whole thing out.
Yeah.
toss the whole thing out. And so what ended up happening was that I basically stumbled into writing a supplement to improve Genasi, and it's been very interesting.
Yeah.
Because
Hell
it's not
yeah.
only mechanical, but it's also lore-wise, and it's been very interesting coming up with lots of cool ideas for how to improve them in terms of like playability, giving them more interesting things than just like a cantrip and maybe a resistance, but also it's not the same across the board because for some reason they're really erratically written. But also thinking about how to incorporate both the mixed race coding and the Swana coding into the way I'm writing the like flavor text and the lore text, and having to be very like self-critical, not wanting to fall into any pitfalls, and not wanting to mechanize being mixed race because we've talked about that, but trying to portray Genasi as like a people who, the way I see them, what we talked about last time, as a people who are fundamentally very different and diverse from one another across all the different like elemental ancestries, but who have the unifying experience of being Genasi, which was why I relate to them being mixed race so much, even outside of what C wrote about them. That, you know, we on this panel are all so different from one another, but we all are unified by the experience of being mixed race.
Yeah.
And basically trying to put that thought and feeling into
Yeah.
into
So they'd see
writing
each other
about
in town
Genasi.
and they'd point at each other and be like,
They
"Ah!"
give each other the nod
The Metal
from
Gear
across
Solid
the screen. It's
exclamation
like,
mark. It's like it's basically just all of us in this chat doing the Spider-Man point meme. Like,
Yeah.
Genasi don't say hello to each other. They just,
I understand.
Carry on.
But yeah, that's been really interesting because I've not written for TTRPGs before. It's been a really interesting experience trying to fix things that I see as not working.
Never forget your first time trying to fix
Yeah.
TTRPG. Good on you. Good on you.
I take the
never
cannon and I fix the cannon.
Never forget your first time trying to fix D&D, right?
Yeah.
Well
Well, I
done.
mean, literally, like one of the first characters I made was Elise, and I made a custom Storm Genasi, and then I've just iterated upon that since then, and then it's just been like, oh, I mean, I guess maybe I'll just write a supplement then, and
I guess
I'll
I
just put
live
all of this
here
into
now.
the supplement.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is my life now.
This
Who
hole
knows when
was
that will
made for
come
me.
out, but yeah, who knows when I'll actually finish that, because writing D&D is hard, y'all, but
Never forget your first time trying to finish what you start writing.
Jeremy,
that
hold
hurts.
me.
I got my own problems. I got a million things I'm trying
I
to
also
finish,
have
too.
a bit of that going on.
I have a lot of that going on also, and I gotta tell you, it just
Yeah. Daniel
I'm
drops
attacked on
in
that from
to
the
say-
art front. Like I'm attacked on
Yeah.
that from the art front with how many works in progress I have left to
Oh
abandon.
God.
Oh
Mhm.
god.
Yeah.
But if you finish it, let me know because I want to see. And also I just want to see if I can like apply that to Faye because yeah, I'm not fully 100% sold on the Genasi stuff that was just the coast. Because also I agree with you. Like the Genasi needs so much better like,
Yeah.
stuff. Like
They
yay,
deserve better.
Air Genasi can cast levitate. Cool.
like, oh, these cool people who are like, they're like elemental primordial people. Oh, how are we going to give them mechanics that reflect that? Oh, you can cast produce flame.
I can make a person float once a day if they don't make
Yeah.
the save.
Oh boy, Air Genasi really get the short end of the stick. They don't even
I am
know.
glad that I saw like in the new one that like my thing was like I think they can now do shocking grasp and then eventually
Water
they can make someone.
Genasi now get like poison sprays. Like that's not good enough.
I think the one thing I liked about it was I get instead my starting speed is now 35, which now makes my character Faye even monstrously faster because she has the mobile feat too. So she's
I was
just
gonna say, give it the mobile
goodbye.
feat too.
I understand. I'm currently playing a Dampier monk who is just ludicrously fast.
So fast. It's like, I'm the party's Sonic the Hedgehog. Let's go. I'm going to wreck your rooftop encounter.
Yeah,
Drew's character is also completely silent when he moves.
yeah. I have boots of elven kind, so it's just.
I love that. But yeah, I want to see that stuff. I want to see it.
I'm gonna share this shit with you guys after this.
I love
Put it in the
Like-
council chat.
Yeah.
Council chat.
I'm calling it that now.
Meeting
I know
next
Daniel, I think Isa, were you the one? You named it the Lewiston Appreciation Society, but it's also
It was
the secret
supposed to be a
council.
goof for one day, and then I forgot to change it back. We can change
I
it
think
back
that's
for
a story.
mixed
That's a
race.
story of all
I
group
thought
chats.
This was
Oh, no,
never
no.
going to change. It was going to stay at the Lewis Tan fan appreciation chat.
That's just you and me,
I'm
Daniel.
sorry, Daniel. It's just it's just you and Sonya.
We should switch it around to various mixed celebrities.
Hey,
Yeah.
that's a great
That's a
idea.
good idea.
This
Bruno
week it's
Mars
the
Society.
Andrew
Appreciation
Koji.
Society. Well, on that note, I feel like on the note of Keanu Reeves, I feel like we've come full circle.
As all things start and
Very
begin,
started.
we end with
Yeah.
Keanu Reeves.
Is it really a mixed race panel if we don't talk about Keanu Reeves at some
No,
point?
it's not.
And we mentioned him, so now it's over.
No.
Yeah.
Um, but it is about time. And I just want to thank you guys for coming back for part 2 and for Drew for joining us for the first time for
Yeah.
part 2.
Thanks for having
Drew,
me.
you're
And
awesome.
and for Jeremy's dog for being really cute. I
Oh,
wanna
she's
pet it.
fidgeting around now.
Yeah. Have out here.
And Drew's Capri Sun.
Yeah, I'm 25 years old. I pay my taxes and I drink Capri Suns every now and then.
Yeah. Yeah,
It's your
that's
right.
your right.
Yeah.
God given right.
If you want
Yeah.
your juice out of a pouch, like that is
Yeah.
your right.
Yeah, yeah,
Some grown man
Um,
stuff right there.
yeah.
Absolutely. Well, I think we should go around one more time, and I think everyone should plug their shit because people here do amazing things and everyone needs to know about them. So let's go back in the same order as before, which was starting off with Kimchi.
Well, I'm Legal Kimchi. I run a YouTube channel where I talk about TTRPG topics, do video essays on deep dives on various issues from history, politics, social issues relating to the games, or just around the community. So if you like that sort of thing, want to see some deep dives, including my upcoming video, which should be out soon, or may already be out, depending upon when this is released, on POC in Western European history. You can check it out at youtube.com/legalkimchi. You could also check me out on Twitch at twitch.tv/legalkimchi, where I usually have conversations with individuals in the TTRPG community about whatever topics they want. Recently, we've gone over things like geopolitics as opposed to international relations and the differences between the two, to occasionally doing things about legal issues that come up. Like I just did a discussion on the Texas trans executive order that our terrible governor put out and the legal ramifications of that. So if you like that type of stuff, please give it a check out. I'm Legal Kimchi on all social media, Twitter, Twitch, and YouTube primarily.
Kimchi, wait, before you end your intro, what was your pizza flavor?
Oh, it's pepperoni.
Not the toppings, the flavor.
Yeah.
The whole profile.
The whole
Woody,
thing.
woody notes.
What was
Yeah.
the mouthfeel? Yeah.
Hints of oak and hibiscus.
Sure. Sure.
I still have the crust. I really wanted to finish it, but it felt weird eating on camera. So,
But what were the toppings though?
it was just pepperoni pizza.
Okay.
This pizza was intended for my children, so it was very basic.
Oh my god, Kimchi's stealing food from his children. What the hell? Anyway,
Oh,
it's Drew's
gotta go on
turn.
Twitter. Hold on, I gotta say something real quick.
Anyway, it's Drew's
There's a
turn
Twitter thread
to
calling for
plug.
that. Yeah, so like I said, my name is Drew Kwan. So if I don't have particularly any projects going on right now, but I manage our amazing Discord community. So if you want to be a part of that, you can go to the Asians Represent Patreon and get in that way by becoming one of our wonderful patrons. Or if you'd like, you can find it on aznsrepresent.com. There's a contact form where you can fill out an application. You can also probably find the link to that in one of my pinned tweets, or you can also go on to our Asians Represent Twitter and you can find it there. But yeah, come over and join us. Have some fun.
Do it.
Yeah. Hell yeah.
Good community.
Emma, who are
Make some
you?
poop
Where can
jokes,
people find you?
Yeah. So Emma, I am on Twitter as @starchiologist, and I am an archaeologist who studies starch to try and recreate past foodways. But more relevant to what we're doing here is I also work as a cultural consultant and sensitivity reader in TTRPGs and pop media in general. I'm currently slowly working on my own thing that I think is kind of going to be just a source book. So like maps, NPCs, and world setting, things that you can use whatever system you want for. And it's based on early 17th century Nagasaki.
Ooh.
So during the time of samurai, but there are 0 samurai characters because F that. And it's a period of time when Nagasaki had a lot of mixed race people. So there are a lot of mixed race characters running around, living their lives, being people. So that's something I've been slowly working on by myself every once in a while. And maybe one day it'll be finished.
I believe in you.
What a
Thank
mood.
you. It also involves a lot of ghosts.
Nice.
So
nice.
it's a paranormal thing where everyone from different parts of the world bring their ghosts with them. So
That's cool. I want to know about
That's
that.
fun.
Can we have
People
a
are
secret
haunted.
meeting after the secret meeting? Where we talk about that
yeah.
Secret
More
meetings,
secret
stats on
meetings.
stats on stats.
too?
Secret meetings within secret meetings. We'll use the room function on Zoom.
Yes.
Sidebar.
Anyways, that's me.
Sonya, who are you?
Ah.
Where can people find you?
Hi, I'm Sonya. You can find me across all social media at Sonya Baloney Art. I'm a freelance character designer and illustrator. In terms of stuff that's come out for me, I worked on Uncaged Goddesses, which is the final book in the Uncaged anthology. It is 21 tier 4 adventures featuring feminist reimaginings of the neutral and evil aligned goddesses from Faerun and beyond. We actually managed to reach gold bestseller in 1 week.
Woo!
So that's
Hell yeah.
bonkers.
That's amazing.
Yeah, check it out. The
Congratulations.
book is really, really good. The artwork is everybody just fucking snapped on that book. Go check it out. It's available on the DMs Guild. I'm also one of the many contributing artists for Die Hard Dice's Adventuring Artist Tarot deck. I did the Wheel of Fortune card, and they're going to be revealing all the other cards up until I think the deck is going to be available to be purchased through Die Hard Dice March 20th, I believe. So keep an eye out for that. I'm also part of the Unbreakable art team. We got some stuff coming down the pipeline, so keep an eye out for that too. So yeah.
Woo. Nice. And Jeremy, who are you? Where can
Yes.
people find you?
I am Jeremy. You can find me on social media, Twitter at Pixel Grotto, where I talk about TTRPGs, talk about retro video games, which greatly influence my TTRPG sessions, and I've been writing for D&D Beyond for a while now. You can see my articles about Call of the Netherdeep stuff is up now, and there's stuff for future books that'll be coming later. And you can see various bits and pieces that I've written for other tabletop role-playing game companies on the portfolio link on my Twitter account. So check that out. And if you need somebody to write stuff for D&D or Pathfinder or Call of Cthulhu, which are the systems I know best, then hit me up.
And I have been Izza, and if you want to find more of what I do, my Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube are all Evil Clever Dog. I am a designer, like costumes and props and sets and stuff like that, and cosplayer, and
Cool
I
shit.
make cool videos about making cool shit.
It's so cool.
It's amazing.
Thank you.
It's good stuff.
I'm thank you. I'm currently working on a cool little commission for Dark Dice podcast, which I have like 2.5 weeks to finish from this
You
point.
got it.
I've got it. It's gonna be fine. But that's a cool like D&D related thing that I'll probably be making a video about after the fact. So keep your eye out for that, and I guess also keep your eye out for when I eventually finish whatever this Genasi supplement becomes.
Hey, I'm working on a thing I was supposed to finish last July. So it's
Oh wow.
The work never ends.
I will say
Never.
again, what is time?
What is
Soup.
time?
Literally.
In this world we live in.
Other than that, I'm a TTRPG streamer, and I'm on some various things at the moment, but honestly at the moment I can't remember which of them I am and aren't allowed to talk about, so I'll just say go follow me on Twitter and you'll see when I tweet about it.
It's a blanket NDA. Just
Episodes of a thing for Three Black Halflings I was in recently came out, I think. I don't know, I don't remember anymore. But yeah, that's me. And I just want to thank every one of you once again for being part of this panel. This has been so much fun. I know last time we talked about how it was just so great to be able to just shoot the shit with a bunch of other mixed race people and just be able to vibe as well as complain. And it's very cathartic and it's very good. But hopefully it's also been very educational for the people watching, I hope. So yeah, thank you so much to my other panelists for joining me, and thank you everyone who hopefully in the future will be watching this. Woo. Thank you so much.
That was awesome. That was awesome.
That was so incredible.
That was just the fourth time I listened to it.
That panel with the voices on it was so incredibly valuable. Just like I can't gush enough. Like I learned so much, and I know a lot of people look to me on Twitter or on other like platforms to be like, educate me and like be a source of information, but I can only do so much. These folks here, they are all also experts. They know what they're talking about, and it's wonderful to hear them talk.
Yeah, absolutely. You know what? I mean, we've been trying to put a lot more effort and be a lot more intentional with the kinds of panels and the kinds of episodes that we do on Asians Represent. I mean, in the chat we were talking about like, are we going to do this or this? And doing these live reads actually takes away from our ability to do panels like this, because we only have so much bandwidth to do this. So I'm super, super, super grateful for that we are doing more episodes like this. I'm sure this won't be the last one, and Izza will shoot me a message and just be like, I've got an idea, or if anybody who was on that panel wants to do anything, if Kimchi's like, you know what, Asian lawyers, TTRPGs, let's do an episode on that, because there was a lot of archaeology and not enough legal stuff. So happy to do anything, honestly, on Asians Represent with those people. They're great folks. That said, who's also great, Steve?
Who's that, Daniel?
Who's that? Our patrons are fantastic. Shout out to all of the amazing folks who have been supporting us since we launched the Patreon, and have been able to help us like grow Asians Represent and keep it this sustainable. We actually took all of our like last month's Patreon, and we just what is the thing we did in the Discord? We boosted it. What is it that the young people do?
I was really happy about this because we took all those funds and we directed it into something very actionable, which is we boosted our Discord so that next time, actually very soon, we're gonna have a event night, movie night, other like streaming events that happen ad hoc.
Yeah,
we'll have higher stream quality, higher voice quality.
Oh, it actually affects the actual streaming on the server?
It does. So, having that kind of upkeep means that people can come in and like hang out, and it's a little higher quality. And with Drew, our community manager, who was obviously on stream, we're going to start implementing more ways to engage with the server for your private groups for tabletop RPGs and things like that. So instead of having your own private server, you can use our server to take advantage of the higher bandwidth, the higher audio quality,
cool.
and things like that.
So like people can actually
progress.
Host their home games there, basically, or like meet people there and then kind of go and actually play the game in the server rather than have to leave and go elsewhere.
Exactly.
Oh, that's cool.
That's exactly it.
That's super neat.
Because as a community where we have this, these resources flowing through, we should absolutely share those with the community that just kind of joins up because, they're looking for a place to belong or a place to at least resonate with. And I think this is really within our values and our goals.
Yeah, and another thing, we were able to go and not only purchase, because if you win an ENnie, you have to purchase. You only get one medal, and you have to purchase all of your additional ones. If you didn't know that, we were able to purchase ENnies for everyone on the Discord team, and ship them out to everyone. I know some of them are still in the mail, going all the way over to Asia. But we shipped them all out, and that's thanks to the amazing folks you see on the screen right now. My partner is getting Marla because Marla appears in every single Asians Represent episode. But thank you to all of our Disciples of the Sky Court, our Guardians of the Realm, Brooke, Pixel Grotto, Jeremy. Shout out to Jeremy. Jeremy and I are actually going to be working on a project together soon, and with Drew as well. It's going to be sweet. Daisy May, Arjun Nair, Justin, Wayan, and Sunlit Music. You folks are awesome. And we have some people who are not just awesome, but also most honorable. We have the most honorable Metal Weave Games, the most honorable Valorous Games. Shout out to Liana, who needs to come back on the podcast in the future. The most honorable Dungeon Glitch / Matt. I see you in the chat. And the most honorable ×2 Epic Impulsed. And now my ex, who is a friend of mine here in Toronto. That said, Marla is going to make an appearance. Let's lean Marla. Marla, are you going to say hi to everyone? Marla, do you have anything you want to say? No? No, you just surprisingly...
She was getting more comfortable with it.
Surprisingly calm. Now she's just angry.
Now she wants to kill us all.
Marla,
great.
Are you... Okay, there we go. Squeak.
Okay.
Got a little squeak there. But Marla loves all of you, not just our patrons. But if you'd like to kind of join the conversation, continue the conversation about playing mixed race characters or just learning more and sharing your experiences, your games, what's going on, you can join our Discord server. We have Steve. Wow, that was Marla. Yes. You can head to our website, aznsrepresent.com, head to the contact page, and you could fill out a form there. Drew will go through every single application and kind of vets everyone. Alternatively, you could become a patron, and that gives you instant access to our server. But we hope to see you there. Thank you for your support, whether it be on Patreon or just showing up, being a viewer, joining the conversation, or just, doing some good in your own community. This has been a great 50th episode. So happy that we did this. Steve, I really appreciate you. And I'm really excited for our next episode when we do our 2-year retrospective of our Twitch journey.
I love that.
Yeah.
And thank you too. Happy 50th.
You've
done so well.
Happy 50th. Yes. Oh God. Ancient. But that's it. Oh.